So this is the second of our series in Master's teachings for accelerating our spiritual growth. And last week we talked about technique as a way of accelerating spiritual growth. This week we're going to talk about attitudes that accelerate our spiritual growth. And then next week we will talk about a lifestyle, the kind of lifestyle that will accelerate it. So tonight we'll talk about attitude, and we have some questions from last week and we'll answer questions from tonight. So I think what Davey and I will do is we will each talk 15 minutes or so on tonight's subject, and then we will answer questions, and maybe we'll talk a little more than 15 minutes. But at any rate, we'll leave a good chunk of space at the end. So if you have questions as the talk goes on, or at any rate, remember them, and we'll start by answering the questions that came in written from last week. Okay, so attitude. Now, this is a really important subject. You know, when Swamiji was starting Ananda, he would often talk about how attitude was the most important thing of all, even more important than techniques. And so let's start with the dictionary definition of attitude so we know what we're talking about. The dictionary says that attitude are those thoughts or feelings that affect our behavior. And so the thoughts and feelings that we have form into a kind of one could say a sphere of like thoughts and feelings, and that becomes an attitude. The way Swamiji put it is that when we have a thought, it is just a thought, but if that thought becomes repetitive, then it becomes a thought habit. And if that thought habit affects our feelings or our thinking, then it becomes an attitude. And so we want to talk about a couple of things. One, what those attitudes are that will help us, and conversely, what some attitudes are that are going to hurt us, and then how we can work with the attitudes. So we might think of attitudes as arising primarily from the subconscious mind. And so we have lots and lots of different kinds of attitudes. You know, if you think in terms of the different chakras, we might have from the base chakra, which has to do with security, we might have an attitude that I'd never have enough money. I never seem to have enough. I have to really work. Maybe I don't have to care so much what happens to other people. And so we might develop a negative attitude around a sense of insecurity, which is the feeling that would give rise to that repetitive thought pattern. And I've known many, many people who constantly are thinking about financial issues, constantly worrying, constantly anxiety-driven around it, checking their bank account all the time. And I don't need to go on because you get the idea. So that sense of lack and that sense of having to fend for oneself is an attitude that can develop, and it can not only affect one's behavior, but it can dominate one's behavior. These kinds of attitudes, as they develop, can become extremely important and extremely powerful, which is why Swami kept saying in the early years, attitude is more important than technique, because until we get a certain kind of grouping of proper attitudes, then it's very hard for us to stop obsessing or stop behaving. Remember, attitudes affect behavior. and so stop behaving in certain ways. And so let's address how to know what the right attitudes are. There are probably hundreds or thousands of attitudes that we can adopt. But the proper attitudes, the really proper attitudes, are filtered down from the superconscious mind. Remember, we were saying that the attitudes and these thought patterns and habitual thought patterns reside in the subconscious. Well, the cure for them filters down from the superconscious. And so anything that we do that is able to raise the level of our consciousness, remember, superconsciousness comes about because our mind becomes still and focused with high energy. That raises our consciousness up toward the superconsciousness. What we're really attempting to achieve is samadhi, but that's a difficult, distant state. But when Swami developed the Nayaswami order, he said that he wanted it to be samadhi affirming as opposed to world rejecting. See, world rejecting looks at renunciation kind of behind. I don't want this, I don't want that, I must not think this way, I must not have those things. All of that, it's rejection. But Swami wanted the Nayaswami order to be samadhi affirming, which is the consciousness rising up into absolute unity with God. Now, from that state is where the really high attitudes come. And so the great sages and saints who reside in that state or touch that state, then they come back and they give us the proper attitudes to have. In some cases, these become laws. Moses, who touched that high state, came back with the 10 Commandments, as you can think of them as laws, but they're really attitudes, proper attitudes that were helpful to the individual, but then helpful to the whole nation that he was trying to form, the nation of the Israelites. He was trying to give shape and promise to that. Well, in a lower age, as it comes down, those attitudes get frozen into law. And law is different from internal attitudes. So law might be something like to use a very simple example, like a speed limit. There's a law that says you must not drive over 60 kilometers per hour in this zone. Well, most people ignore the law. They're looking at ways to cheat. So what happens? So the first law has to have supporting laws, and pretty soon you have a room full of laws that are like this whole room, and most people are thinking about how to avoid those, how not to do them. And so that's not attitude. That's not the proper attitude, I should say. What we want is to be internally driven, to be samadhi affirming, and in this case, not just the unity of samadhi, but one could say the details of proper alliance with how to integrate our energy. Master talked about how we have to learn about and follow universal principles, universal laws. In America, they have sometimes amusing bumper stickers. And one was gravity. It's the law. So you have to follow the law of gravity. Well, those kinds of universal laws that are there he talked about the laws of health. So for this body, there are certain laws, certain ways of behaving, of eating, and so on, that produce a healthy body. and other ways that don't. And so he talked at great length about how we need to align our will, our thoughts and behavior patterns with these universal laws. And if we do, then we become healthy of body, healthy of mind, of emotions, and of spirit. And if we don't, we become unhealthy and we think God is punishing me. Well, God isn't punishing you. We're punishing ourselves for disobeying the laws. Just as if you disobey the law of gravity and step out of the window here, you'll pay a price for that disobedience. And then you might shake your fist at God and say, why did you do this to me? Well, it's the same with other universal laws. So let's talk about some of these universal laws, and then I want to talk about a couple of them that Master emphasized most directly. One way of looking at them is, for instance, what the right things are, is to ask what are the behavior patterns of those great saints and sages who were in that state and then told us these are the things that will be helpful. Here in India, one of the clearest systems, one might say, are Patanjali's yamas and niyamas. So he's taking from samadhi, and he comes down with the yamas, and he says these are the ways of thinking and behaving that will attune you to universal laws. So nonviolence. And nonviolence and all of Patanjali's yamas and niyamas are the outward activity is the least of it. So yes, we need, of course, to be nonviolent outwardly, but most all of you have read about Master and Sri Yukteswar and mosquito land. Sri Yukteswar was in fact talking about yamas, the first one of nonviolence. Mosquito landed on Master's arm, and he went to swat it, and then he thought, no, I shouldn't do that because of the teaching of nonviolence, ahimsa. And Sri Yukteswar said, why don't you complete the deed? You've already done it in your mind. And so it's the thought process. See, the attitudes are really not, they may result in actions or result in behaviors, but the attitudes themselves reside in our consciousness. And so nonviolence, non-stealing, non-lying, non-sensuality, non-greed. And why are these important? Mainly because if we follow them and we don't do it as some external system that I'm trying to find a way to cheat, but we internalize it and we understand that for our benefit, our well-being, we want to follow the thoughts of nonviolence and non-stealing and so on, that if we do that, we find that we then get into a harmonic relationship with universal law, and we're supported by it. So Patanjali goes on to say that when we perfect these, we actually develop what we would think of as supernatural powers. But they aren't supernatural, or they aren't magical, or they aren't even strange. For a great saint, of course wild animals will be tame. There's a man that we were good friends with. He's passed away now. But for those of you who know him, know Hashi Mukherjee, because she stays here from time to time. Her husband, Devi Mukherjee, wrote a charming book called Shaped by Saints. And the title is a beautiful title. Early on in his life, he wanted to go and spend time with saints because he wanted his life to become shaped by those saints, not by his own will. And he talks about an incident that's very interesting. he was wandering around in the Himalayas, and at one point someone suggested that he should go and find Swami Narayan, who was in isolation. He was living as a hermit at that time. And so Devi went far. I'm not sure what district it was in, but it was up in the Himalayas. After some time, he found Swami Narayan, and Swami Narayan told him to go away. But Devi said, "Yes, but your disciple so-and-so sent me here." Swami Narayan relented and said, "All right, then you can stay." Well, that day, he told Devi, "Don't come out at night. Stay in a little hut here." And then at night, Devi looked out. Swami Narayan was in the kind of courtyard or the area outside, and there were 10 or 11 tigers there. And they were all gathered around, and he was petting them and playing with them. And Devi could see them out there. And so, but he was told not to come out. And so the next day, Devi said, "I want to come out. I want to play with the tigers too." And Swami Narayan said something very interesting. He said, "Your love is not yet pure enough." He said, "Your love is only at," I think he said 60%. "And if it's less than 100%, then the tigers will eat you." And so love is an attitude. Love, friendliness to everyone. And so Devi was in the process of developing this to perfection. Kind of one aspect of love is, of course, not wanting to harm what you love. And so nonviolence is an attitude that springs out of the heart's energy of love. And so in the perfection of love, then wild animals become tame in your presence. In the perfection of non-stealing, anything that you need automatically comes to you. And so on. So you develop what we think of as magical powers, but the great saints think of, well, it's the natural concomitant of having proper attitudes. Now, let me end by talking about two of the very most important attitudes that Master talked about. Since I've been talking about Patanjali, Master gave a number of classes on Patanjali, and it never got published. A few of them got published in a book, but not the whole series, because he gave them to his close disciples. And so usually it was on a Sunday afternoon after the other activities of the week had finished up, he would have a gathering, and this went on for years and years. And he would have a gathering, and he would just spontaneously begin talking about the aphorisms of Patanjali. And so I went through those lectures at one time, and I thought, I'll give them titles, and so that we know at least the subject that he's talking about. Well, I think there were 45 of these lectures, and about 20 of them had in the title, non-attachment. So to his close disciples, he talked over and over again about non-attachment, how important it is, how not being attached to things, having an attitude of non-attachment, how it frees us from the linkages to the material world that keep drawing the energy down. And so one of the things, and Swami has often talked about it, one of the things that we can do is to develop an attitude of non-attachment. Swami said at night before you go to bed, to visualize the heart as a golden globe, and to make sure that globe is shining. He said you can see any attachments you have as kind of like ropes or strings coming out from that. Break them off so that your heart is completely clear, completely shining. He said we should go to sleep at night, having given everything back to the Lord, so that if for whatever purpose the Lord calls us in our sleep, we don't leave with attachments in our hearts. So that attitude of non-attachment, one could say, is like a meta attitude. It has ramifications in many, many other areas. And then the last one that I'll talk about, and this to me I think is the very most important, and I think Master and Swamiji both felt it was most important, is attunement with the Guru. So attunement with the Guru aligns us with the flow of grace and the flow of proper consciousness that answers all the questions that we might have. And so these things don't arise, and we don't develop it just passively. We have to work at it. And so attunement with the Guru, we have to work at that as an attitude. And I would suggest that you always end your meditations. I do this. I pray for complete attunement with Master's will for the coming day. At my morning meditation, I always mentally end before I get up. I usually bow to Master's picture, or I bow to the mental image of Master, and I pray that my thoughts, my will, my actions is his prayer. But I don't always pray in any formal way. I just pray, and it's more than a prayer. It's a sense of self-offering, but self-offering isn't right either. It's the sense of aligning myself with Master's will. And then I try to keep that alive throughout the day. So as a question comes up, or as some difficulty comes up, I can't always remember. The mind gets distracted. But if I can remember, I refer that to Master. Master, what should I do here? Master, what should I say? Master, Davy and I meditated and prayed before coming to do this class. And during that, Master, what's right to say? What's right to talk about? And so that continual, active, dynamic attempt to align ourselves with Master and his divine will, to me, is the highest of the attitudes that will fix everything else. It's like the medicine that cures all diseases.